It's time to find the truth about the transfer portal.
Here's a little screen, and they find Edwards. He breaks it back with running room on the move. Edwards down the sideline. Dylan Edwards, touchdown, Colorado!
We're entering into the third season of the transfer portal being a key component in college football. And I think the wildest part about being alive for this era in college football has been trying to examine the effects of the portal. No one can seem to agree on what the transfer portal does. And I think that that's something that's really shown through in a lot of different areas, down to the way Vegas puts out spreads. I mean, Colorado was a 21-point underdog to TCU, and they went out and won. That was because of the transfer portal. They weren't banking on that or factoring that into their formula. You have people that say stuff like, oh, well, they got a bunch of guys through the portal. They're really going to succeed this year. And they'll take those words and twist it the other way and say, oh, they got a lot of guys out of the portal. You can't win with guys from the portal. And it's just crazy to see all the contrasting opinions. No one can really come to a consensus on how to treat the transfer portal. So what I wanted to do today was get together, look at the numbers over the last 3 years and try to figure out just how the transfer portal has been treating these teams that use it and these teams that don't use it. So to start, I went to On3, which somehow is the only recruiting website that has available rankings for the transfer portal that factors in the guys you gained and the guys you lost to the transfer portal, which it blows my mind that Rivals and 247 and those other recruiting websites, ESPN even, have not caught up to speed to do that. It's really important to factor in not only your gains through the portal, but your losses. Like Texas A&M is rated as one of the best portal classes in the country right now by all those other sites, but that's wrong. Everyone knows A&M lost so much talent in the portal. That's a lie. And so I think it's really important to be able to factor that in. So that's the first mind-blowing flaw, is that On3 is the only website that is currently factoring in the gains and the losses when calculating a ranking. But back to what I was talking about, I went through On3 and I took into account the gains and losses from the last couple years and calculated the average transfer portal class for every Power 5 team over the last 3 seasons since the portal exploded and since it reached its current iteration that we all know about. Another glaring issue that I'll point out myself is, yes, this is only the Power 5, 70 teams in college football. It doesn't have any of the Group of 5, which is another flaw because On3, because it's so extensive factoring in the gains and losses through 70 teams, they weren't able to factor in the Group of 5. They're not included in the rankings. You have to go manually crunch the numbers by what the score is, which is something that I think is a flaw with On3. And so it's really, there's no great place to go and do it, but that's why we're examining the Power 5 to see what the effects the portal's having. And so those are the numbers that we'll work with. So the first thing we're going to look at is who has used the portal the most. I've got the top 20 teams extracted from the last 3 off seasons, including this one that's still actively ongoing. And we took a look at who has used the portal the most or gained the most from the portal. And there shouldn't be a lot of surprises here. A lot of these teams are pretty publicly known for recruiting well in the transfer portal. You've got Colorado, Louisville, Ole Miss, Kentucky, Florida State, Miami, USC, the list goes on and on. These are teams that have relied heavily on the portal, all 20 of these teams, and they've had mixed results. There's not one rule of thumb where you can say they were just all bad or they were just all good, it was all great, it was all terrible. You just can't. There's not one rule of thumb, but I do think that every team out of this list can fall into one of 3 categories, and that's something that I think we can take something away from. So the 3 categories that I think they fall into are boom, bipolar, or bust. And so let's show you which teams fall where. And so you've got the first one, boom, which is the first one we'll focus on. And these are the teams that relied heavily on the portal and greatly improved their status and boomed as a program. Most notably Colorado, who went from awful to respectable in this last season and pushing a bowl team, and they can use that to hopefully boom again this season because they're going right back to the portal. You've got a team at Louisville that I mispronounce all the time and I get made fun of. Louisville? I'm not really sure. My brother said that in Kentucky they tell you you're supposed to say it like you've got a mouthful of marbles, and so that's the way I do it now. But Louisville went from not getting over the hump to being a legitimate New Year's Six threat this year. Texas, Florida State, Michigan, they all used it to become legitimate contenders. So you're seeing all these teams utilize the portal, and it's booming for them. These guys, it's really worked out for. In the next category, we've got bipolar. These are the teams that relied on the portal, and over the last couple seasons, the last 3 seasons since they've been relying on the portal, they've just been inconsistent. I mean, look at just South Carolina and USC alone over the last 2 seasons. I mean, last season, they were both cruising through, winning games nobody thought they should be winning. It was Lincoln Riley's first year at USC, and he was in the Pac-12 title game. And then at South Carolina, they were beating Clemson down the stretch. They beat Tennessee when they were a playoff contender. And they were 2 teams that nobody wanted to play, and it was like, oh my goodness, look how they use the portal. And then fast forward to this season, they were both bitter disappointments. South Carolina goes 5-7, misses a bowl game. USC completely spirals, loses 5 games. And so for both those teams and the rest of the teams in this category, yes, you could say it worked at a certain point, but the results just have not been consistent. At least we have the bust category, and these are a couple teams that there's no doubt they've increased the talent level on their roster through the portal. They've increased the amount of stars, the amount of former blue chip recruits, the amount of current highly rated players through the portal. Arkansas, Miami, Auburn, Wisconsin, Indiana, and they've done that, and yet it hasn't mattered. On the field, things have been downright ugly. I mean, you look at what Arkansas has done the last 2 years, it's just been downright bad. Indiana has struggled to win any conference games. Wisconsin, with the churn, bringing in Luke Fickell, they weren't able to have the year 1 success that some of these portal experiments were able to. And same goes for Miami. Cristobal has great recruiting classes too, which is even more baffling. That might say more about Cristobal than Miami. And then a team like Auburn, they used the portal really effectively this offseason, and it didn't translate directly to wins. And so you're looking at this category, and this almost makes it feel like, well, what the heck? If these 5 teams weren't in the sample size, you would almost be able to say, yeah, the portal can help you succeed, but now you're hesitant to when you see these teams in the sample size. Something that I think is really interesting, though, is if you remove teams that had a top 10 recruiting class from this sample size. And so if you do that, it removes a lot of the boom teams, like almost half the candidates in that pool. And the other thing that it does is it removes almost all teams that have a significantly higher ceiling than any of the other teams. And I think that goes to show that the portal is a nice tool that you can use to bolster your roster, but it can't be the foundation. If it's the foundation, things are going to be inconsistent. And I think the important takeaway here is that any of those teams that are in the bust category can just as easily be in the boom category next season. Like, we could see Arkansas or Wisconsin or Indiana finally hit on some transfers next year and end up in the boom. And that's the reason why I think we see bipolar. I think that if the portal goes on long enough, every single team out of these 20, maybe with the exception of the teams that have top 10 recruiting classes, will end up in the bipolar category, because it's just not something that can be consistently relied on to make up the bulk of your roster year to year. There's just so many more variables to take into account, even more so than in recruiting. So let's go ahead and jump forward. Who has lost the most in the portal? We've got the bottom 20, and it's a little all over the place. So we're just going to go ahead and jump forward, and we're going to break them up into categories. So let's break it down. If your team was hurt by the portal, it means one of 3 categories. We've got 3 categories again. The first one, don't need it. For Bama and Georgia and Texas A&M, the only reason, and Florida, the only reason you're seeing these teams near the bottom of the portal rankings is because they don't need it. They're recruiting really well. They have a bunch of talented players in their roster that are naturally going to churn and accept NIL offers and go to other schools. That's just the reality of the situation. That's why you're always seeing Bama and Georgia near the bottom of these rankings, and then Florida and Texas A&M also near there. They lost their coach. It's something that happens to these teams that aren't in the Power 2 conferences. Duke, Arizona State, Oregon State, Cincinnati, Houston. They lose their coach, and they literally just cannot protect their roster from the hawking teams in the portal, and that's what happens. They just get their roster completely shredded, and there's nothing they can do about it. And then there's the final category, which is can't/won't. So the can't/won't category, I think most notably includes a team like Clemson, where they just refuse to use the portal, and I think that it might be the same case for Oklahoma State, where they just, because of their principles and because they're an old school coach, they don't abuse the transfer portal, which, say what you want strategically about that, but that's just what the coaches do. And then essentially all the rest of the teams in this list, they just cannot. They have shown that they are literally unable to field a really solid, complete transfer portal class. And because of that, they're struggling and they're falling kind of behind the curve. And if you look at essentially all the teams in this category, how many of those programs overall would you say are on the uptick right now, are trending upward? The only one I think you could really even have an argument for is Northwestern, because David Braun just turned in one of the most insane coaching jobs we've seen and managed to win 8 games. But none of those other programs are really headed in the right direction. And even the ones in the lost coach department, you can't confidently say are trending upward either. The last piece of evidence that I wanted to show is pretty damning, that if your roster is attacked in the portal and you lose more talent than you gain and you end up near the bottom of those rankings and you're not one of the schools that can recruit at an elite level like Bama and Georgia and Florida and Texas A&M, you're going to be bad. We look at the bottom 5 from the last 3 off seasons in the portal, and it is just some terrible fall-offs. And so for the 2024 teams, Houston, Cincinnati, Duke, Washington, Oregon State, that are currently the bottom 5 not elite recruiters right now, that's horrible. You look at the bottom 5 from last season, Purdue was coming off a division title. They, I believe, won maybe 4 games this year because of that collapse. Syracuse was coming off of a mediocre season, but they ended up being worse this year because of it. Stanford ended up being 3-9, awful, coming off of a not-so-great season. Cincinnati, they were a solid team in the American, and then complete flop first year in the Big 12, and just a lifeless team, one of the worst in the Power 5. And then Washington State, they were coming off of what was a bowl season, and they just regressed to a team that completely flopped down the stretch just because they didn't have their guys. The same trends can be seen from all the 2022 teams. I believe Oklahoma State went 7-6, and that's like the best to show. Now that we've gone all over that together, I hope you can contextualize better just what the transfer portal is doing to teams, whether they're succeeding in it or whether they're flopping in the portal. And I think the rule of thumb is that if you're not an elite recruiter and you're near the bottom of the transfer portal index, factoring in gains and losses, it's going to be a rough year. It just is. And if you're near the top, it could be a boom year. It could also be a bust year. It is not a great thing necessarily to have a really low-ranked recruiting class and a really high-ranked portal class. That's not necessarily the recipe for success. That's the recipe for flash-in-the-pan boom seasons. It's not as sustainable or as secure as doing it the other way, the traditional way, which is recruiting, which I know is going to be pleasant to hear for some people who think like Dabo Swinney. So that does it for this video. I appreciate you guys for watching. We continue to march towards that 1,000 subscriber mark. We are so close, man. I feel it. I think we can hit it, dare I say, by February. I think I'm going to put that out there. We're going to keep doing a video per week. If you watched it and you enjoyed it, go ahead and drop a like, comment, subscribe. I appreciate it all, but I will talk to you guys later.